Hello and welcome to a special edition of Chopper's Brexit Podcast with me, Christopher Hope, the Daily Telegraph chief political correspondent. This week, we've got just one guest, Charles Moore, former editor of the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph and the Spectator magazine, who has just finished work on the third and final volume of the authorised biography of Margaret Thatcher, called Herself Alone. To put this into some kind of context, Charles Moore quit the Telegraph in October 2003 to devote a large part of his life to writing this biography. And that was 16 years ago, nearly 3 times longer than the 6 years it took Leo Tolstoy to write War and Peace. This final volume, Herself Alone, bears certain similarity to that famous Russian novel. It weighs in at nearly 1,000 pages and covers a great sweep of history from Mrs Thatcher's final years, including the end of the Cold War. It begins with her 1987 election landslide and ends with her death and funeral in 2013. In between that, the Cold War ended, Nelson Mandela was released in South Africa, and Mrs Thatcher was betrayed, my words, by her own party. It is in every sense of the word an epic undertaking. Charles Moore, welcome to Chopper's Brexit Podcast.
Thank you, Chris.
So I'm going to introduce listeners to this because it is so long, and in fact this podcast didn't even exist by the time you started work on your third volume, so there's somewhere to go. But how were you approached to write the book? Was it by Lady Thatcher herself?
Yes, it was, through an intermediary, and it was a complete surprise. I think what happened was that, like all prime ministers after leaving office, she had a mass of personal papers, and in 1997 she decided what to do with them. You may remember that her own university, Oxford, refused her an honorary degree, so she decided to give them to Cambridge.
Yes.
And they went to Churchill College, yeah. And at that same time, she was advised, somebody's going to write your biography, obviously. Why don't you, rather than standing completely back from the process, identify someone with whom you have a reasonable relationship so that you can give them the access so that they can get on with it. And this fell to me for reasons that I don't actually know.
Do you think you were your age? You were familiar with the characters of the Thatcher story? You were
well, I was
editor of the Telegraph, of course?
I was young enough. I did know the people involved, and I'd had a good, though not close, relationship with Mrs Thatcher. I think all those were relevant considerations. Yeah. I'd covered the period in journalism, of course.
And it was a full-time job. Of course, you're well known to readers of the Telegraph as our regular Saturday columnist, and also you write the excellent column in The Spectator. So aside from that, was it your main full-time job working on this book?
I couldn't possibly say that, or that would annoy my employers, the Daily Telegraph. I've been doing 2 full-time jobs for the last 15 years.
But you took a lot of your time up.
Yes.
And how many interviews and have you carried out and documents studied? Have you tried to work out the number?
600 people have been interviewed.
Gosh.
And I couldn't really estimate the number of documents studied, but in her period as Prime Minister, Mrs Thatcher saw more than 1 million documents crossing her desk.
Wow.
And I will have seen a big proportion, though goodness knows by no means all of them. And I will, of course, have seen a lot of other documents as well. To give you a sense of the amount of background material, in this third volume there are 4,300 endnotes.
Yes.
That's to say source references.
Gosh. And not all of those documents are published, are they?
No, that's right. And it takes quite a long time for papers to be released if they're government papers, and some of them are still not released. And the point about the special access I had was that I was permitted to see all the paper and to quote almost all of it. I have, when each volume comes out, I have an opportunity, an agreement by which I must submit the manuscript to the Cabinet Office, not for their political approval or anything like that, but to check there's no clash with national security and that sort of thing. And so you sometimes get minor disputes about naming of certain names, a code name perhaps of an agent, something about a specific operation, something like that. But
even now it's still subject to a degree of secrecy.
Yes, in some areas, in rather what you might think of as all the obvious things like royal things, intelligence, military, Northern Ireland.
You weren't sworn to the Privy Council to do this?
No, but I got government, the usual vetting procedure.
Was there anyone who didn't want to help? I mean, given that the Thatcher family approved of it, was that an open book for everybody, or was some
yes,
said no?
What Mrs Thatcher really did for me was turn the key in the lock. asking everyone to take part. So almost everybody did. Almost no significant refusals.
And you're allowed to be critical of her and her legacy.
Well, this is the marvellous thing, because, of course, it would be hopeless history if I wasn't. And she very sensibly said, I, Margaret Thatcher, will not be allowed to read this book, and it cannot appear in my lifetime. And that sends out a message that I'm free. And it also sends out a message to people who are frightened of her that they can talk without her knowing what they say.
Or worried about offending her at all.
So this was a marvellous position to be in, because I really did have the freedom.
Have you found with the sale of the first 2 volumes, there's a market out there for Lady Thatcher and what she thought? Of course, lots of people at the Telegraph think she's a wonderful person, but is there a good market for the book?
There certainly is. They're bestsellers. And also there's a great global interest because she's such a figure of woman power, and of certain sort of doctrines of Thatcherism, and of victory in the Cold War. All of those things are very big. And I think also now people like to compare her leadership with the sort of leadership that the West gets these days.
There's also a degree of appraisal of her record, isn't there? There was that very good documentary recently about the BBC which put into context the glass ceiling she battered through in the 70s and the context of what she's up against in quite a sympathetic way, wasn't there? You saw that documentary?
Yes.
And were you encouraged by that? Do you think people are now ready to set aside the poll tax and the dockers and the miners' strike and appraise her whole career?
I think the general tendency of the passage of time is to make people fairer in their assessments of great historical figures. And the point is she's very controversial, but she was a great historical figure. And that needs to be seen in the round. And one of the very important aspects of it is the woman bit, the fact that she's the first and only really important woman.
And just for new readers and new listeners, what period does the 3 volumes cover?
The first volume takes you from birth to the Falklands victory.
Right.
And then you have the middle section, which is when she's on top. And then you have the final section, when she starts off being on top and then she falls and then she goes into retirement and so on.
We'll come on to the new volume shortly. What was the most surprising thing you discovered about her in the course of your research?
Well, the most completely new bit of private information I discovered were a whole load of letters that she wrote to her sister when she was a very young woman, which completely revealed a different side, the human Margaret Thatcher, the Margaret Thatcher who's more interested in clothes than politics, and the Margaret Thatcher who, quite contrary to what she told me, had several boyfriends before marrying Dennis. And at one point she had 3 boyfriends at the same time.
Did she?
One of whom was Dennis. And she was trying to make up her mind about who was the really serious one.
That was Margaret Roberts you're talking about now,
Margaret Roberts, yes.
So what period of time, when was that? How old was she then? And
this was this key year was in 1950-51. And she was really making sort of the choice of life, which meant career, and it also meant marriage partner.
Yeah. Have you found things as you've gone on that you wish you'd put back into the first, second editions? Or
you mean new things?
New things, yeah.
They always come up because people always produce things too late. But I got one thing, brilliant luck. In the first volume, the whole thing was actually printed in proof. We had 8 days to go before it actually appeared. And a chap I knew slightly got in touch and said that his father had been the chairman of Finchley when they selected Mrs Thatcher. And he said that his father had told him that his father had cheated on the vote in order to make sure that Mrs Thatcher got
thumb on the scales,
the nomination, because he wanted a woman and he thought she was great. And so she got in by a cheat. I don't think she ever knew that, but it's quite an interesting start to her political career.
Quite lucky she'd die when that came out, wasn't it? It might have had a question her entire route she took. Charles Moore, thank you. Before we go on to discuss Herself Alone, we'll have a quick break.
Hello, Chopper listeners. My name's Danny Boyle and I'm the Telegraph's Commuter Editions editor, which means it's my job to provide you with great journalism that makes your journey to and from work as enjoyable as possible. I can't prevent train delays or guarantee you won't get caught in the rain, but I can make sure you're up to date with the best of the Telegraph every morning and evening. And I just wanted to let you know about one of the ways you can get all that in audio form. All you need to do is join my WhatsApp group. Every weekday, my colleague Chris Price and I bring you short audio briefings directly to your smartphone at 8 in the morning and 5:30 in the afternoon. And the best bit? It's completely free to sign up and easy. Just click on the link in the show notes for this episode. I look forward to having you as a group member soon.
Right, we're back in the studio here with Charles Moore, the official biographer of Margaret Thatcher. And the final volume of his 3-volume work of her life, Herself Alone, is out this week. So, Charles Moore, looking at the new book, I was really struck by what you found out about John Major's treachery. I'll put that in quotes to avoid being sued by John Major. But how do you describe what you found out about the way he behaved shortly after her downfall, as she was falling?
Yes, I don't use the word treachery because I think Mr. Major was in a very difficult situation. But what happened was she wanted him to nominate her for the second ballot, as he'd done for the first. And he wanted, in fact, to stand in the second ballot. And he therefore was most reluctant to nominate her for the second ballot because he might miss his chance. On the other hand, he didn't dare not nominate her, and all the row that would then ensue. So what I discovered from a letter he wrote to her PPS Peter Morrison was that he arranged, and from other sources actually, he arranged that the nomination paper of Mrs Thatcher that he signed would only be delivered if he'd already been promised that she was not going to stand in the second ballot. So so he was able to say in public, I nominated her, but he did so knowing 100% that she was not going to stand.
And the context.
So he had it both ways in the most brilliant way.
Totally. And the context of there was he had toothache, didn't he? I mean, he wouldn't be able to say anything.
Mr.
in public.
Major was the only person in the cabinet who was not present in London, apart from one minor person who was in the Far East.
Yes.
Mr. Major was the only one who wasn't present in London.
In Huntingdon, wasn't he, famously?
And he was at home in Huntingdon with a toothache, with wisdom teeth, having been removed. And this actually was an advantage to him because he was considered not to be part of the plotting that was going on like mad in Westminster. I think I've established, however, that he was extremely well informed about exactly what was going on.
And it's before mobile phones, before WhatsApp and email, I mean, before podcasts existed. So it was much, hard staying in contact without being by the phone all the time.
Part of the irony of this was that one very important call to Major had to be found by the switchboard at 10 Downing Street, because in those days they were the best people in the world to get hold of someone. And the call that was going through to him was a call to work against Mrs Thatcher.
And you gave a detailed account, didn't you, of how the cabinet came in one by one and said, it can't go on, Margaret, you've got to go.
Yes, there's a contemporary record kept by her principal private secretary, Andrew Turnbull, that nobody's ever seen before, which records what they said. And then, of course, I've interviewed a lot of them as well. So I think I give the fullest picture yet given of how they went in and how a lot of them had worked out beforehand what they were going to say and agreed it with one another.
Were there surprising names in there amongst the treachery? My word again, treachery. But were there some surprising names who?
Well, I think the overall surprise was that so few people supported her. And also that John Wakeham, who was officially her campaign manager, was really, for sort of understandable reasons, but nevertheless he was managing her departure, not her victory.
Were they quite keen to speak to you, these Conservatives, after all this time?
Pretty much everybody agreed to speak. Obviously, there are some things they don't wholly want to talk about, but one way and another, comparing one person's evidence with another, comparing documentary evidence and so on, you sort of get there, and I hope that everybody feels included.
Yeah. There's some great facts in the excerpts the Telegraph have published over the weekend. I love her holding hands with Dennis on the way to the palace, these little things.
Yes, and Dennis said this is when she's departing. And
yes,
he says,
after resigning. Yeah.
He holds her hand, which is something he wasn't a very demonstrative man, normally didn't do. And he says, steady the buffs as she goes towards the palace. And then
the poignancy of her decline after she stood down as MP and became Baroness Thatcher. And one point there when you said that her daughter Carol gave her a phone book because she hadn't dialed anyone directly since 1979. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it?
Downing Street always makes sure the Prime Minister can get anyone they want on the telephone. And so it seems likely, though I can't prove it 100%, that Mrs Thatcher didn't ever dial anybody, and she didn't really know how to, almost. Phones had changed a lot in her 11 and a half years inside there. And so she was this was one of many, many things which she just didn't know how to handle. She didn't know what an answering machine was, for example, which had come in during her time, and so on.
I remember David Cameron telling me something about driving a car. He never drove a car.
Yeah.
Since he became Prime Minister until he stood down.
I don't think, in fact, Mrs Thatcher never drove a car again.
At all.
Because of partly anything else, security.
And I was struck by the poignancy of her hearing a problem at 7 a.m. on the Today programme, which is her favourite radio programme, working out a solution and no one to tell it to.
Yes, because one of the reasons that she was very successful in government, and it's very much part of her character, is that she loved making decisions and getting something happening. And so this desire to do it when you can't anymore is rather like pushing your foot on the accelerator when the car's not in gear. You just make a sort of roaring noise and nothing happened.
And she had this she felt full of energy, didn't she?
Tremendous. In her early years of retirement, tremendous energy, frustrated energy.
And hard for what to do with her as well. I thought John Major, he's not a bad man, is he, John Major? He was doing his best to deal with her.
I think the thing about Mr. Major is he's super calculating. And he had very great difficulty in managing Mrs. Thatcher because she was a much bigger figure than him, and also because she was trying to be a backseat driver, which is very hard for the Prime Minister. He wants her support, but on the other hand, he doesn't really want her around.
And she was unhappy with the way her legacy was being trounced, maybe, by John Major on poll tax, community charge, I don't know.
Mrs. Thatcher felt that her legacy was being undermined. She was annoyed about getting rid of the poll tax, but her biggest thing was what was happening about Europe. And how she felt that was all going wrong with the Maastricht Treaty and so on. Yes,
and one of the experts talked about that amazing Bruges speech that she gave. Mm-hmm. Was that the point at which she turned into a Eurosceptic?
That's 1988, and that's the first time that she set out in public her severe reservations. However, it is basically a pro-European speech with scepticism in it rather than anti-European speech, the Bruges speech. But later on, after she left office, she never went public on this, but she said it to a lot of people, including me. She did come to the view that we should leave what was then the European Community and is now the European Union.
That is contested, isn't it? Because I remember during the referendum campaign, someone who worked with her closely, Number 10, said she'd have voted to remain. Am I wrong in saying
No,
that?
You're right about that. Charles Pearl said that, but that's a speculation about what she might have done. And, of course, nobody can prove that one way or the other. But what I can say definitely is what she did say. And she did say to many people privately, people advised her not to say it publicly, but she said it to me frequently, that we should leave the European Union.
Because it was becoming a political project rather than an economic one.
Yes, and it was we were losing our independence and our democratic freedom, yeah.
It's almost mirroring the Tory party's move towards Euroscepticism, isn't it, really? If you talk to
I wouldn't say mirroring it, I would say foreshadowing it.
Yeah, leading it.
Yes.
And Charles Moore, in the era of Greta Thunberg and how this 16-year-old is telling adults how to deal with climate change, what's interesting is the excerpt in which you talk about how Mrs. Thatcher led the way on tackling climate change.
I must say this was a bit of an eye-opener to me when I studied it, because, of course, I remember Mrs. Thatcher's speech at the Royal Society in 1988, where she got going on it. But I had no idea until I looked into it how serious she was about it and how sustained she was. And she made 3 really important international speeches about it and pushed forward the whole global movement, which is based around the UN International Panel on Climate Change. And in a way, people wouldn't think of Mrs. Thatcher as being like this, but she was convinced as a scientist that this was a problem. And she really began to... She essentially set out all the main arguments about global warming that we know today. And some of her natural supporters were not too happy about this and slightly tried to gloss over this or get her to change her mind later in life. But, of course, she would have been against... Of course, she was against the sort of... attempt to squash all economic growth and that sort of thing. But she did believe very much that there was this serious risk and that it required international action, and she became an eloquent advocate for it.
Again, I returning to the days after Dennis died, and she wasn't sure whose funeral she was going to at the Royal Hospital Chapel. I actually went to the chapel when she'd go every Sunday. She'd go, wouldn't she?
Yes, she went. Yes, the Royal Hospital Chelsea, where the pensioners are. Yes,
that's right, and deeply moving. And then her faith kept her going, but she had no one to go home to. I mean, it's.
It was quite lonely. Luckily, she was very well looked after by carers, and it wasn't downhill all the way. She did recover to some extent from Dennis dying in 2003 and had a few good years, and then it got worse again. But it was obviously very sad that somebody of such, well, it's always sad, dementia, but you particularly struck by it when you see there's someone of enormous capacity who now lacks that capacity. However, it made her rather sweet and gentle, which nobody would have accused her of being all that sweet and gentle when she was at the top. And
quite. Call everyone dear, I said.
She always was kind to staff, it must be said, always throughout her life. But, for example, I saw her, she was obsessed with feeding dogs and cats, and she loved being with them. And she liked simple things like a beautiful bowl of flowers or something, and she wasn't worried about what's happening in the world anymore.
And with her grandchildren putting milk down for the cats in South Africa, for example.
Yes, her grandchildren are American, in effect, because they live there, and they know that you shouldn't feed milk to cats, but she didn't because she was of an older generation.
I didn't know that.
They,
I thought you could feed milk
they're
to cats.
lactose intolerant cats.
I see. So it's not good for them.
And so her grandchildren were sort of amused, half shocked, half amused by the way she'd rush out and put milk down for Pussy.
And the shock of leaving office, again, back to 91, when she was left with a very small income, really. And I was looking, because recently there's been some stories about Nick Clegg getting all sorts of money to run a private office, £120,000 a year. And that dates from 1991. So clearly the state moved to address the issue of former prime ministers.
Yes, when she suddenly had to leave office without warning, this is part of the important point, but this was without warning, she was in some difficulty because she was absolutely hugely globally famous and massive demands upon her. And I think it was 30,000 letters from the public, for example, to answer, and incessant. And she had only an MP's income, which was then much lower than it is now, and a prime ministerial pension, which is much, much lower than it is now, and almost no office costs and so on. So actually, she was incapable, either in terms of organisation or in terms of money, of doing what was really demanded of her. And it was a bit of a scandal, actually, because it was really hard for her to operate.
Yeah.
And
she had protection in the car, didn't she?
Yes, she always had, of course, protection because she remained number one on the IRA death list till the day she died.
Did she?
And that's, of course, another consideration. One has to think about ex-prime ministers, Nowadays, it would be more of an Islamist threat, probably, but it would, the actual risk to life remains very high, particularly with her because she'd been so long, because she was so hostile to the IRA. It's a serious anxiety all the time.
And she died in a suite in the Ritz, didn't she?
She did. She fell ill. She had an operation for cancer in hospital, and it became clear that she wasn't well enough to go back to her house, which had lots of stairs. And she was helped by the Sir David and Sir Frederick Berkeley, the owners of the Telegraph, as they already were by then and are now, to stay in the Ritz. And after a bit, it was sort of obvious that she wasn't going to come out. And they kindly said, well, stay on.
And
she did. And she died there after being there for about 3 months or a little more.
And that bookending of a life with her humble beginnings and
From
ending.
the grocer's shop to the Ritz, yeah.
Perfect ending. Charles Moore, thank you so much. And there will be more to come with her legacy after this short break.
Order! The Prime Minister will be aware that Podcast Live Politics will return to London on Saturday, October 5th.
Indeed, I imagine people in this house will enjoy seeing Chopper's Brexit Podcast and the Delling Pod, whilst the Honourable Gentleman will no doubt enjoy seeing Polling Politics to see how badly he and his party are doing.
Typical Tory bluster. I believe the Prime Minister would benefit from seeing the new European podcast, UK in a Changing Europe, and to think about Ian Dale and Jackie Smith's For the Many. Order! 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 Whether the House wishes to see talking politics or escape Brexit with the week unwrapped, there will be plenty of room for everyone. Even the Liberal Democrats can see never mind the bar charts. And all of these podcasts are live in London on October 5th. Indeed, tickets are available now from podcastlive.com. Unlock!
OK, we're back in the studio with Charles Moore, the official biographer of Margaret Thatcher, whose book this week, Herself Alone, is being published. Now, Charles Moore, about the legacy of Margaret Thatcher, surely the ending of the Cold War is what she did a lot to contribute to.
Yes, it was a sort of great irony of her last difficult 18 months in office, that at the same time as she was running into serious trouble at home, she was an absolutely huge global figure about the Cold War, and she was very much identified with victory in the Cold War for the West, because she and Ronald Reagan together had been the great architects of, first of all, confront the Soviet Union, defeat it in terms of the arms race, and then bring it to the table. And she had helped persuade Reagan more than anyone else that we should talk to Gorbachev, for example. And this all happened, and it happened in the way that she'd hoped, which was peacefully, of course, and because of the peaceful uprising of the actual people of the Soviet bloc. She was particularly close to Poland in that respect and was very influential on the changes there, and also much admired by the Russian people. So this was really hugely recognised when she went to Poland in November 1988, when she went to Armenia and Ukraine in 1990. You see literally hundreds of thousands of people cheering her, throwing flowers. And at the same time, everybody's saying how dreadful she is back at home. And,
yes.
and it must have been very difficult for her psychologically. But if you look into how this plays out, I was in Poland this month talking about this and meeting people. She is regarded as an absolutely pivotal figure in the change from totalitarianism to Western democracy, which people in the Soviet bloc see in a way as actually the final end of the Second World War, because they came under the tutelage of Stalin because of the Second World War, but they didn't actually get the full peace and freedom until 1989.
There are lots of Margaret children in Poland. There's lots of Tony Blairs in Sierra Leone, for example.
I can't answer that, but she certainly is a very popular figure. There was a slogan a friend of mine saw at the time in the market in Warsaw, which somebody had written out in English: "Mrs Thatcher, buy Poland."
Where would you rank her in the list of all-time great world leaders? I mean, are we getting to that point where we can now think of her in this? I mean, I know that her fans talk about her as a great post-war leader, but...
Well, I think she would have to be ranked high. She made massive mistakes, but this is because she was on a massive scale. And great people make great mistakes as well as great achievements.
She stopped listening maybe to dissent?
That was part of the problem. And she got very bad with colleagues. She thought in the end she was right too often, that sort of thing. But she had a creed which was very clear and will survive her. She had a capacity for action which was very unusual, so that she actually did an absolutely massive amount of things and therefore reshaped a great many things in the Western world and in her country. And also she gave a particular example of woman leadership which turns her into a sort of archetype.
Yes.
So I think people will go on thinking about her and arguing about her for hundreds of years. And I think everybody, will recognise her in photographs and statues and so on.
And that energy, I remember you described how she buried a tree with John Major and she got fully stuck in, didn't she?
Yes, there's a funny thing in an election campaign after she stood down when they both have to plant a tree, she and John Major on the election trail. And she reckons he's just not doing it in too feeble a way and sort of poking away at the earth. And so she sort of gets stuck in and drives the spade into the ground properly. Very characteristic.
But you say, though, we view her as a great leader. I remember the spitting image at the time, towards the end of her time, which is quite interesting. The spitting image puppets had her going into the gents with male MPs and then using her urinal. And that was almost... To succeed as a woman, she'd had to almost be more manly than the men she was with. Do you know what I mean? Do you understand that?
I understand that, but I think it's completely wrong. I think the key to all of Mrs Thatcher's woman leadership aspect was that she did not believe in the equality of the sexes. She believed in the superiority of women. And therefore, she was not trying to imitate a man. She was trying to beat them. That was the thing. But she was the sort of woman who actually prefers the company of men, though she believes in the superiority of women. So
That's fascinating.
So she actually liked working with men and didn't much like working with women. But what she was trying to do was to take all those subjects which men think they own, money, power, war, diplomacy, and she'll do them herself. And so she wasn't wearing a suit. She was, look how well she dressed all the time. Look how carefully she dressed. Always in a skirt or a dress, never in trousers.
Hair done
perfectly. Makeup, jewellery. Her idea of power was woman power, not imitating male power.
Extraordinary. A real feminist icon then, in that sense.
In that sense, yeah.
Have you had any feedback from people who... You must have feedback from people who knew her and read her and what they're saying about the book? They're happy with it?
Well, people are very kind. I mean... what I try to do all the time is make this proper history, and I hope that people appreciate that. That's to say, Mrs Thatcher is a subject of tremendous polemic, and I've taken part in it myself as a journalist often. But this is not polemic, this is history. This is trying to get into what was she like and what did she do, what did she think and feel, and why did it matter.
And that weighed heavily on your shoulders.
Yes, it is a big burden sometimes because you have to try and construct the architecture of this enormous story. But it's absolutely well worth doing because... it's a very remarkable story.
So, you've finished. Do you feel a sense of relief?
Yes, I do feel a sense of relief.
Quite a weight of a burden on you, isn't it, to get it right and to deliver a fair account of her life?
It is, because when you're doing it, it's a bit like climbing a mountain, and you get that illusion when you're climbing a mountain that thing's the summit.
The false summit,
and then you realise that the next bit, and then the next bit. However, it's a very rewarding thing to do because... which is something that's difficult to do in journalism, you feel you have really conquered a whole area, and that you do actually understand something in a deeper way.
How old were you when you started the book?
Well, when I was asked to do it, I was 40, and when I got down to really detailed work on it, I was 46, I think. And now I'm 62, so yeah.
I wasn't going to ask how old you are, but and what advice would you give your 40-year-old self now?
Well, I'm glad I didn't know what it involved, because if I did, I wouldn't have done it, and I would bitterly regret not having done it. So I'm glad that I went into it.
Just the sheer scale of it.
Because of the scale, yeah. So I'm glad that I went into it with my eyes not fully open.
And I was going to ask, were you right to quit as editor of The Telegraph to do this magnus opus?
Well, one reason that it all got going a bit late was that I didn't want to quit immediately, because I'd only been editing for 2-3 years when I got the offer. So I quit after 8 years of editing, and that, I think, was fine.
Has there been a personal cost to embark on this book? I mean, I've written a book. It took me years and years, and it was hard work. But you've done a generation of your life has been doing this.
Well, you do have to work too hard. That's probably difficult for your family, the journalism and the book. But also, I think people sometimes think there's a lot of money in books, and of course, a big biography of Mrs Thatcher is well paid. But if you think of the amount of research you have to do and time you have to take, it's the worst paid thing I've ever done.
What you pay per hour. I'm like 50p an hour or 30p an hour or something dreadful. Can you let Margaret Thatcher go? Can you stop viewing life through how she would have thought about things?
I'm sad to say goodbye to this extraordinary subject, but it's the right time to do so.
And what will you do with the time?
First of all, I should just have to go around promoting this book and talking about it, and then perhaps I'll lie down for a bit and think.
Well, Charles Moore, thank you very much for coming into Chopper's Brexit podcast and telling us about this extraordinary book.
Thank you very much.
Now, before I go, and for the very last time, let me remind you that this weekend you can come and see me interview Steve Baker, chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs, at Podcast Live in London on Saturday the 5th of October. Tickets are selling fast, so do go to podcastlive.com to get yours and use the code CHOPPER10, all in capitals, to get 10% off your ticket price. So thank you to my guest this week, Charles Moore. And thank you to the producer this week, Theo Ludis. If you'd like to get in touch, please tweet us at Brexit Broadcast or email us choppersbrexitpodcast@telegraph.co.uk. And always buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. Until next time, cheerio!